So, welcome to another edition of Chatting with Ingram. Now, this is a special one for the International Cyber Expo, which is on in London on the 27th and 28th of September. And we will be, as it says in the title, talking all things cyber. But by way of introduction, the chair of the advisory committee for the International Cyber Expo is Ciaran Martin, CB, or Professor Ciaran Martin, CB. Ciaran, great to see you this morning.
Thank you for having me, Philip. We're lovely to be talking to you again.
Yeah, well, cyber, it's one of those subjects that just keeps popping up. Everyone seems to throw out at every moment cyber, and then when the newspapers get bored and television gets bored, people seem to start talking about cyber, and it seems to be very bland. The latest I think was an NHS attack on an NHS supplier that seems to have been hit with ransomware. And is affecting access to patient records and bits and pieces. But is it really that big a threat?
Well, it depends how you characterize it. I think we've sensationalized cyber over decades. You go back to people as old as us, and we can remember the 1983 movie War Games, where a young Matthew Broderick hacks in by accident to the Pentagon from a suburban Chicago bedroom and almost starts a nuclear war. And that sort of that combined with more serious things such as warnings from the likes of US defense secretaries and CIA directors about cyber Armageddons and cyber 9/11s, I think set a tone that cyber involved catastrophic risk. There's an element to which that's true, but it's a pretty small element. And I think over the last few years, we've come to understand cyber as a more pernicious, but ubiquitous threat and risk to all sorts of different things. So you mentioned ransomware on healthcare services. That is a huge problem amongst rich democratic countries. It doesn't cause operating theaters to fail mid-operation with the death of patient or patients, but it does massively disrupt, as we saw in Ireland last year, we've seen in France, we've seen in the United States. It disrupts the bookings, the admissions of patients and so forth, and things that actually damage people's health. You see quite a lot of economic loss, data loss, lots of other points. So what we have in the cyber domain is a very attritional sort of set of threat actors, both nation states and criminals, with different motivations that can do all sorts of harm, often not particularly visible. Or not immediately visible, sometimes, as in the case of ransomware, quite visible. So, and it can involve, for those companies and public organizations unlucky enough to experience it, it can involve existential risk. Chief execs have lost their jobs, companies have gone bust because of these things. So it's not actually, here's one way of looking at it. I've lost count of the number of times over recent years where people who do TV dramas and movies and so forth would come up to me and say, we'd really love to make a dramatization of just the glamorous world of cybersecurity. And say, well, good luck. And I know, obviously, with the Undeclared War, Channel 4 made a decent fist of it, but actually, it's a really important set of strategic risks. But the day-to-day reality of it, both as defenders, as potential victims, and even as attackers, is quite mundane manipulation of computer code for a variety of purposes. So it's a really important risk, just a much less glamorous risk than we were led to believe.
Yes, I think Channel 4 did a good job of trying to glamorize cyber and all the bits and pieces. And I love watching the social media where all of the the cyber aficionados were going, oh, this can't be right, and that's terrible. And you forget about you're not the audience. The audience is the general public. And one of the things you said there about scaremongering being the approach to cyber for so many years. I find it fascinating that people understand what to do behind closed doors in their houses, and they know when to close the curtains in their room before they get up to various activities. But they'll do those activities in a cyber environment they don't know who's watching and doing what. Do you think a lot of this is down to wider education in society, and we need to invest more in getting that understanding and education out there?
Some of it, but I take a slightly contrarian view on this point, Philip. I think that the difference in your analogies is that people understand their own homes. They've bought them. They might well have done them up. They grew up in one. They have a basic understanding of how housing, neighborhoods, and physical security works. It's not really true in cyberspace, So I often feel that, let's take a professional as well as a personal environment. Let's take, people who work in healthcare or food retail, both perfectly noble professions doing good things. And you want them to be as good at healthcare and food retail as they possibly can be. And you want them spending as much of their time as possible doing those functions. You don't want them to be worried about cybersecurity all the time. And you certainly can't configure your cyber defenses in a hospital, in a major food retail outlet, on the assumption that all these people that you've hired in to do medical diagnosis, to do development of food products, to do marketing, distribution, whatever it may be, you don't want them spending all their days hovering over URLs saying, or fighting with unusable password controls. You want them to be doing their job. So I think sometimes, in no way am I diminishing the importance of training and education and raising awareness, but any organization that thinks, right, it's okay because I can train my staff, I can train, or a country to say, we can train all our citizens to spot dodgy URLs, to apply perfect security practice and so on, and that'll do the trick. That's madness. You actually want to give the user as little to do as possible and make it as easy as possible for them to do it safely and well.
Yeah.
So, and also, like a long career in government service, different types of careers, but I started in the late 90s, and the information security doctrine in the late 90s was that any leakage of any paper with any form of classification on it was some form of offense and incident. And in the digital age, that's just not possible, right? So you have to work out what matters, and you have to assume you're going to get breached. Even if you get a click rate on phishing emails down from 25% to 1%, that's still 1%.
Yeah.
So somebody's in. Can you detect them? Can you cauterize where they can go? That's not for the user, that's for the owner. So yes, to education, training, awareness, but never, ever depend on it totally. It's madness.
Well, classic example of that. A friend of mine was the chief information security officer for a rather large company, and had arranged a red team to come in and try spear phishing attacks under control against senior executives across the company, after having run an education program over a period of time and done as much as he could to try and change the culture. And he came into his office that morning, he switched his computer on, his phone went off, he was making his coffee, he was looking around, emails came up, and there was one that he thought, oh, I need to respond to that now, as the coffee machine went beep, and another SMS came in from his wife asking something, and he clicked and went going through. He was the first person to fall for the red teaming spear phishing attack that he had got organized, and he was the chief information security officer. So if it can happen to someone at that level who knows that there's an attack coming in, you can't then blame the general workforce that's out there. So I agree with you completely that it's getting the tools right to be able to make it as easy for the user to operate and do what you're paying them to do, not to try and become pseudo cybersecurity professionals at the same time.
So there's a fantastic blog on this by my former colleague at the National Cybersecurity Centre. He's still there. I'm not. Dr. Ian Levy, and he did it with a guy who calls himself Ciaran Reborn. His real name's James. He's from Manchester, so he adopts a slightly glamorous nom de plume for some of his cyber work. But I recommend everybody read this blog. It's called The Serious Side of Pranking. Now, what James Linton, Ciaran Reborn, did. He had this track record in duping senior people in the British and American government. So he got the then Home Secretary it was all harmless. It was just testing stuff. He didn't do any actual harm. He got them into conversation. He got Jared Kushner in the Trump White House into conversation, managed to arrange dinner with them or something like that. And he did this by very clever phishing emails that looked authentic. And at one point he decided he'd have a go at the National Cybersecurity Centre. It was about 2018. And so he sent a bunch of really, really cleverly done phishing emails. He sent one to me as head of it. He sent one to Paul Chichester, who's the director of operations, and he sent one to Ian Levy, the technical director. Now, luckily, Paul Chichester and I, or Chich as he's known, we were at the Millennium Stadium in Cardiff together at the same event on a stage. We came off the stage, we checked our emails, and there was an email from him to me, sent when we were on stage. And I went, something weird going on here. He said, yeah, absolutely right. So we were lucky. There was no way we fell for that, but it was a fluke. It was a fluke that it happened at a time where we would know that wasn't a real email. Ian, on the other hand, was on his own, I think in London. He didn't see it until quite late. And he'd been, hugely busy, few weeks, months, whatever, being tired, and he almost falls for it. And he notices a very, very minor mistake. One is sort of almost cultural. He refers to chich as pull, and that never happens.
Yeah.
But the other one was, there's a slight error in the mail to bit of the email. Now, Ian is the world-renowned technical director of the National Cybersecurity Centre, and he was that close to falling for it. And he said if he'd a bit more tired, he would have fallen for it.
Yeah.
Don't go around blaming people for clicking on dodgy links. How are they? I mean, seriously, I'm quite happy to admit that as head of the National Cybersecurity Centre, I'm almost certainly clicked on phishing links in the past, and B, I do not consider myself competent to judge just by looking at it, the sort of authenticity of an email. I mean, sure, if it comes from a long lost kingdom, the heir to the throne of a long lost kingdom, asking for $100 million, I can probably spot that one.
Oh, so I shouldn't be clicking in those. I keep waiting for the money to come into my bank account.
Exactly, but so that goes to the point. And the reason the NCAC published this blog, and it was a collaboration between the Fisher and the Fish, Ian and James did it together and co-wrote it, was to say, look, here's how the psychology works. Here's why you might fall for it sometimes. Here's how you can reduce click rates. But look, network owners, things are going to get through.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so interesting. So it's culture, and it's a blameless culture that will help people if you've got the mechanisms in place to deal with threats that come in.
Absolutely, you've got to help people. You got to understand why people fall for these things. Don't go around blaming them. It's madness.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the Ukraine crisis is going on at the moment. Everyone expected Russia to come in and cause the world to collapse and fall apart through pushing a little button and hitting us all with cyber attack, and there would be Cybergeddon with a cyber war. Why has it not happened?
So only perhaps Vladimir Putin knows, even if he does. And this is being hotly debated for years. So here's my tuppence worth on the various theories. But it is, as I say, it's in the famous Chinese phrase, it's too soon to tell.
We'll talk about China in a minute, don't worry.
Yeah. But so firstly, there has been extensive cyber activity in the context of the war. It's just not been the sort of sensational Cybergeddon stuff that we spoke about earlier, and that's because that stuff doesn't really happen. Okay. Yeah. But at the I mean, Ukraine has been known as Russia's cyber playground since the annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some serious attacks on power grid in Kiev in 2015, 2016. Some accidental attacks that did a lot of economic damage globally in 2017, the so-called NotPetya attack, $10 billion of damage. And there was quite a lot of that sort of activity around the run-up to the invasion, attacks on denial of service attacks on government websites, banks. So they weren't going to bring down the banks in a Cybergeddon way, but they're going to make it quite hard for customers to access money for a few days, which is really inconvenient and annoying and drains morale. But then the Russians launched an attack on the Viasat satellite communications network used by some of the Ukrainian military, and that caused the Ukrainian military significant difficulties in the first few days. I mean, sure, the Russian invasion did not go to plan, but in terms of the excellent Ukrainian defenses, this did not help, and they were quite open about that. So, and then, of course, there's been a classic sort of information war contest where the Ukrainians have given more than as good as they've got. But so there's been a lot of activity there. It just hasn't been the sort of, glamorized tower blocks falling, TV stations going off air sort of thing that people that people have talked about. It all has been targeted in Ukraine, as we've seen in the past. Sometimes they're kind of spillover of that into the West. There was a little bit of spillover from the Viasat attack, but nothing too serious. But Russia does not seem to deliberately attack the West. That, in a sense, doesn't surprise me that much, because I think one of the great myths about cyber is that it's all this invisible domain where you can do things that you can't do in the physical world because it's all deniable. It sort of is deniable, but it sort of isn't. Put it this way, Philip. Let's say we just picked up our phones, looked at the news, and we saw, massive power outage in Miami, highly sophisticated attack, nation state attacker. We'd be thinking, it wouldn't take us that long to draw up a hypothesis.
Well, exactly.
And the technical evidence would be, would likely follow. So let's take that scenario. What sort of position would President Biden be in? He'd be under massive pressure to respond. He'd be under the
Yeah,
same sort of pressure to respond as if they did a Salisbury in the US or
yeah,
another Salisbury in the UK. So you can't just do something in cyberspace
yeah.
most of the time where different rules apply. So if, and I'm not condoning in any way the aggression of the Putin regime, but since their invasion, they have not sought to provoke the West with military style impact, right? They just haven't.
Well, it's interesting. I think part of that could be down to the fact that very early on, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Sec
Yeah,
Gen, turned around and said that under certain circumstances, a cyber attack could be considered an Article 5 level attack, and that in itself
absolutely.
rocked people back, and Putin will have gone, oh dear, knowing how well the 2017 attack had actually escaped to the wild, and not just damaged a lot of Western businesses and healthcare and all the rest of it, but actually damaged their own MOD. So,
Well, and I think, I'm a great admirer and fan of the Secretary General. I think in this case, and he'd probably say this himself, he was stating the blindingly obvious.
yeah,
So, I mean, and to me, that's a blindingly obvious, but sometimes in the cyber discourse, it's not. You can't have a cyber impact that doesn't count, if you know what I mean,
yeah,
in the way
yeah,
that a traditional, if you like,
yeah,
military impact or a traditional covert operation, if
yeah,
if it can be traced to you, and in terms of high-end Russian state activity, it can
yeah,
more often than not. Why have we done all these attributions in the past? Then you're not gonna be able, if you're choosing not to escalate by traditional military means or non-cyber covert means, you're not going to do something in cyberspace. I think in terms of Ukraine itself, there's an interesting sort of set of lessons for us which I think are already emerging. So one is it's possible that the cyber campaign was just as badly prepared as the rest of it, and therefore,
yes, yeah,
they weren't ready. But also, I think there is something about cyber and warfare which helps us think about the risk. So, in all the period, because of course, as any Ukrainian will tell you, they've been at war with Russia since 2014.
mm-hmm.
But in that period of not all out war, if we can call it that, sort of attritional gray zone type
Yeah,
conflict, cyber was a very useful tool for the Russians to intimidate, harass,
yeah,
and disrupt and annoy the Ukrainian people. But in an actual all-out invasion, so let's take the power grid or a TV station. The two Ukrainian attacks on the power grid, sorry, the two Russian attacks on the Kiev power grid in 2015 and 2016 took 1.5 to 3 years to prepare.
yeah,
From conception to execution. In an all-out war, you're left with the choice. As an American commentator has put it, you're the president of an aggressor invading country. You want to take out a TV station. The Air Force guy says to you, look, we can fly over it, come back within 48 hours with a 98% chance of destroying it. The cyber person is, give me 6 months and I'll give you a 70% chance of partial disruption, because that's the way.
yeah,
So in terms of all-out conflict, cyber is sort of less dramatically impactful. That it's a secondary thing. It's not. People talk about, and I think there's lessons for Britain in the integrated review in this. Sometimes people sort of loosely talk about cyber and high-tech weapons as if they were the same thing. They're
yeah.
not. A high-tech weapon is still a weapon, just like a low-tech weapon. It's just a bit cleverer. An unguided. It's the difference between an unguided missile and a
Well,
guided
exactly,
missile, like that.
This is where whenever I talk about it and talk about it from the military perspective, the cyber bit that people think of from cybersecurity perspective is peripheral, and that's nation state and
Yeah,
interconnected critical national infrastructure and devices, bits and pieces. But on the battlefield, this is a shooting war. So
yeah, exactly.
cyber will have no effect on a 7.62 millimeter short round, a 152 millimeter high explosive shell, a 40-year-old aircraft with no connectivity to anything and
No,
dropping dumb bombs. And then on the battlefield, it's got its own cyber, in inverted commas, capabilities with deliberate denial of service through jamming.
yeah.
So that's electronic warfare, and intercept, which is stealing data. So there is a battlefield level, but that will never then hit the headlines. And there's been an effect on that in what's going on. But it's
So it's really important for understanding, absolutely. And, there are major cyber dimensions to modern conflict. You go back to, it's widely believed that the Israeli operation over the Syrian reactor in 2007 was hugely enabled by a successful cyber compromise of the Syrian air defense systems. You've mentioned all the sort of current battlefield impacts, but it's a secondary, albeit a very powerful, sometimes it's a secondary consideration, and I think and a secondary sort of capability. But of course, then away from war, it's a very powerful capability that you can use outside of that
Yeah.
formal declaration. But so I think there are real lessons for us that we saw in 2021, not in the context of the invasion, but in the context of Russian organized crime, just how much damage in peacetime hostile cyber actors can do to healthcare through ransomware, to
Yeah.
food retail, to education, to all sorts of different things. So we need to make sure that we can protect our. None of those were very sophisticated attacks. So we need to make sure the resilience of critical infrastructure is dramatically improved. But then, in terms of our own capabilities, to quote the Chief of the General Staff, General Sanders, who has of course spent most of the last few years championing digital transformation of the armed
Yes.
forces,
With his pentamphibians.
but he's absolutely right when he says, look, there are limits to that, and it's exactly what you've been saying, Philip. And in his quote in his recent Rusi lecture, which I think deserves to become famous, he said, "You can't cyber your way up a river."
Well, exactly, exactly, 100%. No, it's funny. I've called him out publicly in a few of the phrases he came out with whilst he was in charge of strategic command, and he's refocused a little bit now that he's got back into the more tactical weeds with the army, which is a good, which is only a good thing. But you mentioned nation state and everything else that's going on. The other one that's come out recently is Parliament there's been a big furor about the parliamentary TikTok app and putting that out there, and that's raised the question again about the potential for apps being exploited. And again, this is something that I keynote speak on a few things, but are apps a threat? Is mobile device security that sort of threat that could impact us from a larger business perspective, from a national perspective, from an individual perspective? Do we need to be wary of a lot of this that's going on? Is there is China itself a real threat, and do we need to be more aware of what's coming out of it?
Well, where do you start with this? There's probably three things you can say with this. First of all, there's China as a hostile cyber actor, and that's 20 years old, perhaps a bit more.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is economically motivated, theft of IP, alongside traditional espionage, and it does it on a massive scale. It is not, in my judgment, particularly related to ownership. I mean, hackers can hack anything regardless of who owns it. Now, owning it can make things a little bit, so by owning it, I mean having the owner registered and resident in your country, particularly if you're an authoritarian state like China, can make it easier. But you have countless examples of China doing supply chain hacks and other sort of strategic espionage, including commercial espionage via Western tech. So it's a prolific hacker. But actually, I think many companies, particularly larger companies, are and governments are thinking of the threat of organized Chinese digital espionage as business as usual now. It's been so much for so long, and it's pretty big. Then there's China as a strategic technological competitor, which is a very interesting and challenging problem. It's very different from Russia because Russia doesn't have a tech industry of its own. It's got a few interesting AV companies, but China's got its own tech ecosystem. There is no longer a single global internet. China's building its own. It's more authoritarian. It's more state controlled, but also has got massive investment, and it's trying to, outcompete the US. And I think that's a real challenge for us in terms of making sure that ours is better. Because people get very, het up about whether China's trying to sell sell us into strategic servitude and so forth, and there is a risk of that. But fundamentally what China's trying to do is become the number one world economic power, fueled by technological lead, which is a really interesting, and it's a difficult challenge for the West because it's not a cybersecurity challenge. It's tech and economic industrial strategy, trade, and so forth.
Especially when China can plan 25 years out and work slowly in little nibbles towards that, whereas we're planning politically in a parliamentary or a presidential timeline, or tomorrow morning's headlines.
Well, exactly, and that brings you to the app question. So, I mean, I think in terms of app security, it is an important dimension of the whole cybersecurity sort of threat landscape and risk landscape. I think ownership of it is only of moderate importance. So I think the Westminster TikTok thing is probably more symbolically significant than practically significant. I mean, even on the worst case scenario of the wholly owned transfer of all data to the Chinese state, which TikTok deny, but I think you have to work on the assumption that it's at least possible. Then, I mean, the fact that Parliament has a TikTok account does not give access to the entire parliamentary estate of,
Yeah.
do you know what I mean, any more than, you know, you and me uploading this on TikTok instead of whatever we're going to upload it onto. You know, gives access to all of our data. I think also, you know, less sort of jocularly. I think you look at you know, even you know, Western-based apps, and not just the security of those, which is variable, to put it kindly, in quality in terms.
Yes.
But I think, you know, you also got to remember that a lot of this is traded and sold.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so and you know, a lot of these apps collect more data than TikTok does.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, I'm not trying to be particularly, I'm not criticizing the parliamentary decision. I think, you know, there's a case for it, even in terms of signaling and symbolism. I just think, you know, that one of the risks here is that when you get a very complicated, multifaceted problem, because it's not, which goes way beyond who owns what company and where are they based, and it goes all into strategic insecurity baked into generations of technology. You know, there's a risk that you kid yourself by taking, you know, fairly easy decisions, such as let's not have TikTok in Parliament,
Yeah.
that somehow that makes things safe. You know,
Yeah.
we went through all of this in the debate with, you know, Huawei and 5G, whatever the merits, demerits of the different sort of stages of the Huawei decision. The one thing that when the final decision was taken to exclude them from 5G, the one thing that, you know, I was absolutely adamant about was, don't think that this now makes 5G safe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, you know, these are highly complicated pieces of hard and software engineering,
Yeah.
with all sorts of proven vulnerabilities across a global supply chain. Many of them perfectly, you know, innocent in their origin, just, you know, bad engineering,
Yeah.
clever attackers, and so forth. Just don't suddenly think because the Chinese aren't involved that it's safe.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Whenever I do examples, I use a Western example. I use the game Pokemon Go, because it's got a beautiful little bit of history behind it, where it was set up by a guy called John Henke,
Yeah.
who ran a company called Talent Keyhole. Those that understand what Talent Keyhole means,
Yes, indeed.
that you will know the implication. But then whenever he was setting up another company, he got a seed funding from an American company called In-Q-Tel. In-Q-Tel is the front end of American
Indeed.
intelligence and CIA, and that's
Yes.
widely open on the internet. But you then find that with Pokemon Go, whenever you ticked accept terms and conditions, it allowed access to everything that was on the device that you had the app on, absolutely everything. And could go through every bit of data and every other connectivity you had, your browsing history, your location, your contacts, the lot that's on there. And then a little line in there saying, oh, and we're transferring all the data to continental United States for processing, which was interesting in the privacy statement, which brought in some other interesting laws that allowed different government agencies to have a little look at what was going on in there. And it's a good example of what could be done if people wanted to do it. I'm not saying anything about Pokemon Go, apart from the fact
No,
that they give me a fantastic example to get out there and highlight it.
it's a very good example of why the ecosystem is much more complicated and
Yeah.
vulnerable than just,
Yeah.
you know, somebody's Chinese, somebody's Russian, somebody's Japanese, somebody's American, somebody's British.
Yeah, and then from the criminal perspective, the criminal gangs, you know, some of the Russians are big on this. You know, they're run like businesses because they make so much money. Their headquarters may be in Russia, but that's because they know that they can't be extradited and they're unlikely to be prosecuted, provided they keep paying their, in inverted commas, tax to the key decision makers in different governments and all the rest of it. But a lot of the people that are feeding into them are based all over the world. And everything else, and you know, their tentacles go everywhere, and it's businesses what drives what they do, because they make huge amounts of money.
And that's why they've gone into ransomware, because it's the most lucrative, and business model has helped. You know, people are incentivized to pay for all sorts of reasons. The increasing value until recently and lack of any form of regulation of cryptocurrency sort of helps. But I think, you know, all the way through from the discussion we had at the start about dodgy links and all of that, right through to this discussion on Russian criminality. So many of the important sort of levers of response are not technical. I mean, what one of the big problems in ransomware is that the safe haven problem that Russia provides for the hackers. I mean, what they're doing isn't that technically accomplished, but you don't do it out of the United Kingdom or the European Union or the United States or Canada or any of the Five Eyes countries, because law enforcement wouldn't allow it. Russian law enforcement does. That's not a technical problem.
Yeah, exactly, and what's going on. No, it's fascinating. So there's a lot we talked about around this, that impact on the wider cyber community. How important is it for the cyber community to come together at the different conferences? And we're looking at it from an international cyber expo perspective here, conference, and sit down and be able to sort of face to face discuss this and debate it and learn what's going on from the different experts around the community.
Well, it's hugely important, and we missed it during the pandemic. And I think that paradoxically, the pandemic therefore made the resumption of the cybersecurity dialogue more important, because it hugely accelerated our increasing dependence on tech for anything and everything. Anyway, I think there's a key part of this which is about problem solving. There's a lot of technical expertise, there's a lot of concern and worry, and therefore demand for cybersecurity products. But you have to match the two. And when I was in government, I think that's one of the things we paid a lot of attention to. Which bits are the private sector going to solve, so therefore which bits they're going to leave because the commercial incentives aren't there, or the R&D costs are too high, or whatever. But if you take ransomware, I think finding exchange of ideas and experiences about the sort of things that are happening, so that people can look at the right type of solutions is really, really critical. So one of the things I liked about the ICE Expo last year, and looking forward to this year, was just that sort of fusion and matching of, if you like, demand and supply, both need and innovation and skills. And you also get a very interesting dialogue from different experts with different perspectives. So you've got people who, again, going back to the start of this conversation, people who are really into the behavioral side of it, people who are into the diversity, not just in the sort of, if you like, classically political sense these days, but the the diversity of ideas and skills. People really into the technological side, really interesting policy response debates. We had high level engagement from government. So I think it is needed now more than ever.
Brilliant. Well, while you were reading out that list and going through it, I was going through my checklist going, yeah, we're doing some of that. Yes, we're doing some of that. Yeah, we've got speakers in that. So I think we're hitting all the bits and pieces there. And you're going to be there for the 2 days.
I will be.
Opening up each of the days and be around, probably parachuted into one or two other little debates that are going on, which should be interesting. But Ciaran, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. Thank you for giving up some of your valuable time. And if I don't see you beforehand, I look forward to seeing you on the 27th, 28th September at Olympia at the International Cyber Expo.
Excellent. Look forward to it. Thank you, Philip.
Cheers, Ciaran. Thanks. Bye-bye.